In this next video, we'll look at how we add more information once it becomes available or has been decided for the design, such as true north, adjacent buildings, specific inputs that we can set in Revit, even though Insight does a whole array of inputs for us. All those things don't matter until they matter or they've been selected. So once we know certain inputs, we can actually specify many of those within Revit, and then that becomes what's called the BIM setting in Insight. We're going to create a mass element that's going to represent an existing adjacent building. Of course, this will affect the solar heat gain when it does the annual analysis at certain times of the year, which will have an impact on the energy use of our proposed design. So in this case, the key to this mass being a shade and not being part of a complex of buildings is to not assign levels to that mass. When Revit does not see levels, it just treats it as a shade surface. Notice on the Manage tab, perhaps now we know what the true north orientation is for our building. We can set that. In this case, I'm applying a wall by face on the Massing tab, just so that we can see the shadows. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the shadow from this mass as it might impose upon our proposed design. So I temporarily added a wall. I'm turning on the sun path feature. Adjusting the month and time of day so that we can see clearly that this particular adjacent building does have some impact on our proposed design. To clean house here, I'm going to get rid of that wall. Notice when I select this mass, just to point out, we do not select any mass levels for this mass element, so that Insight will know to treat it as a shade surface. If we set the window to wall ratio to 30%, that will be the BIM setting within Insight, as we'll look at in a few minutes. We can also specify the HVAC system that we've selected based on the list. It's also important to know that this conceptual types dialog box is what's used for the BIM setting for all of the Revit big picture items like walls, roofs, floors. Later I'll show you how we can get into more detail than the simple options that are listed there. But for now, based on adding the adjacent shade surface and specifying true north and adding the 30% window to wall ratio, we're going to create our energy model. We're going to hide the mass element, and we're also going to go into the visibility and graphic overrides, hide all of the model categories, and then we'll notice that on the analytical model categories tab, we can hide everything except for analytical shade surfaces to see that that adjacent building is the only shade surface that exists in the project. Turn everything back on. If, by the way, our entire building also happened to show up as a shade surface, that would typically mean that there's a big hole in the building somewhere, and the algorithm that figures out the inside versus the outside and occupiable spaces isn't able to work properly. When you create the energy model, Revit automatically creates these two schedules, analytical spaces and analytical surfaces, which allows us to do a little quality control check to make sure things are the quantities are looking correct. Once the analysis is done, we can add that new run to our existing project. Notice that even in the preview here, we can see the adjacent existing building at the top of the list there. So here are all the available inputs, which are also described as widgets. Building orientation. So wherever that triangle is, that's going to equal the building orientation within Revit. Now that we know what that is, we'll narrow down the maximum and minimum, or the range, to just that one input. If we also know, for example, that the window to wall ratio is 30%, we'd notice there that the triangle is going to be at that 30% mark, which I'm highlighting right there. But if we want to try more or less glass, we can do that analytically.